Thank you all so much for coming to our talk. My name is Janet Heimlich, and I'm joined by Dr. Jaime Romo, and we're going to be talking about religious child maltreatment, specifically in mainstream religious environments. I think it's important to note that RCM is something that occurs or can occur in any religious environment. So I don't want you to think we're excluding cults. In fact, when it occurs in cults is kind of usually at its most extreme. And we'll get into a little bit more about what religious child maltreatment is and what are the biggest risk factors to children. So yeah, we want to first try to get our heads wrapped around this pretty big issue. When I started to look into the topic, I mean, there was information everywhere. People were writing memoirs about their personal experiences. There were studies that had been done, not many, many criminal cases. And I think that people had a kind of sometimes specific idea of what religious child maltreatment is, even if they weren't calling it that. I felt the need to give it a name and also to understand how it manifests itself in various different religious environments and in various different forms of maltreatment. Some of you may know that the four main forms of maltreatment, and by maltreatment I mean abuse and neglect of children. The four main types are sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. They're huge categories, so it's really important that we understand just how we're going to define religious child maltreatment, and then secondly, learn what the risk factors are. When is a religious environment harmful to children? And we'll get into that a little later. And finally, okay, so what changes are going to be made so that we do a better job at protecting children? Religious child maltreatment is child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators, victims, or the surrounding community. And I should say that this slideshow will be available to anyone that wants it. Just get in touch with us. There's a slide at the end where you can get our email address or you can leave us your information. As you may know, I did write a book on the topic called Breaking Their Will, where I go into detail on defining what it is and all the things we're going to be talking about today. What we're going to cover today, though, is going to go beyond that because after I wrote the book, I started, along with Jaime and some other folks, a nonprofit called the Child Friendly Faith Project. And the CFFP raises awareness of religious child maltreatment so that the public, the media, survivors, and others can really understand more about how it comes about. There is some precedent here legally for when people who are of a religious faith are carrying out their beliefs and their practices, and where there's a line that can't be crossed. When, if they're going to continue what they're doing, they're actually harming children in the process and actually abusing and or neglecting them. And this precedent was set by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1944 in a case called Prince v. Massachusetts. It involved a woman who was a Jehovah's Witness who wanted to take a 9-year-old girl out into a public place and have her pass out pamphlets and that kind of thing. Well, not only did the Supreme Court find that she was violating child labor laws, but they actually took it a step further and really got into just where the children's rights begins. And what they said was, in their decision, the right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community or the child to ill health or death. Parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow they are free to make martyrs of their children before they have reached the age of full and legal discretion when they can make that choice for themselves. A lot of times people ask me, what kind of evidence is there that this exists? Do we know how prevalent RCM is? And as I mentioned, that we do see it kind of most clearly in cults, but it really does exist across the spectrum of certainly from that, those totalitarian groups all the way to, I want to say, ultra-conservative, or we might just say conservative, evangelical, or Orthodox groups and organizations. There isn't a whole lot of research on it, but what I've gathered sort of a few of the more key things, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these slides, but just to call out a few important studies that have been done. For example, in 1984, there was a study that reviewed the health status of children in cults and showed that those kids had unusually high incidence of physical abuse, sleep deprivation, and medical neglect. Another 1984 survey looked at Quaker families and found that there was more cases, an inordinate number of cases of violence towards children. A 1985 study which surveyed mental health professionals, this study was done by a professor of psychology at the University of Chicago. She's the only person I know that has really delved into this topic and not just looked at cults. And when she surveyed mental health professionals, she found that the patients, when they were asked to talk about religion-related types of problems they had, found that there were three main categories that cropped up. One is torturing or killing a child to rid him or her of evil, withholding needed medical care for religious reasons, and abusing a child under the cover of a religious role. A 1988 study in pediatrics looked at religious medical neglect. This was a very groundbreaking study in this issue, and the researchers looked at 172 child deaths occurring in church groups that heavily promoted faith healing instead of delivering medical care to its members. And it found that in 140 cases, the children would have had a 90% survival rate had they received medical care. I have three more studies. In 1991, looked at adults and tried to determine their proneness to abusing children. And what they found was the more likely that adults had positive attitudes, the more ideologically conservative the adults were, the more likely they were to have positive attitudes towards physically punishing children. And the more important religion was to parents, the more likely they were to devalue and verbally abuse children. A 2003 study showed that adults who experienced, quote, religion-related abuse, this was done by the same University of Chicago professor, the more that those individuals who experienced those problems in childhood suffered from more serious psychological problems than those who experienced abuse in which religion was not a factor. And finally, a 2005 study showed that individuals who are extrinsically religious versus those who are intrinsically religious have an increased risk of perpetrating child physical abuse. That's kind of a fascinating study, and one that I kind of dug up, that was, I don't know, quite buried. I never hear people talk about this study, but it's quite interesting. And being extrinsic religiously means that you're attending a church group or some kind of religious organization for means that'll get you something like popularity or that kind of thing, or power, versus doing it for your own intrinsic value. Here's some different forms that religious child maltreatment can take. There are religious organizations and groups whose religious doctrines do promote child sexual abuse. They're quite rare, especially when you compare them to most mainstream religions. But what we do see very frequently is a failure to want to report child sexual abuse, to have perpetrators held accountable, especially if they're religious leaders. We've, of course, heard about the thousands of cases in the Catholic Church and the problems that have resulted when parents just feel wonderful about letting their child spend time one-on-one with a priest without really vetting that person's background. And that kind of trust sometimes comes from the belief system that they were raised with that gives priests some kind of holiness that is perceived, and really leads to children being vulnerable. But we've seen the problem of just failing to report child abuse, and I would just say every religious organization I've ever looked at, where there is a tendency to keep it within the organization. Sometimes they'll have very complex internal trials, ways to prosecute these cases, and that's a very good way to keep it within the group, and often do very little to bringing accountability to perpetrators. Just to kind of exemplify this, this is a quote from the Archbishop in Australia, and he's kind of just stating what has been a very strong feeling among the Mormon Church, Catholic Church, and many others, where they want us, if they hear about child abuse said in a religiously protected environment such as confession, they feel they have the right and are righteous in not reporting it. So this gentleman was stating publicly that he would basically rather go to jail than report child abuse he heard in confession. We see examples of physical abuse in many conservative religious organizations. Most commonly in the US, we hear about parents who believe that the Bible tells them that they should be doing physical discipline. They should be spanking or hitting their children or using some implement or various ways to cause pain or discomfort to improve their children's behavior. A lot of times that comes from them being told by a pastor, say, that they're obligated to do that their religion or God obligates them to use physical punishment. We've seen children who have died in various church groups where they were beaten, and not just, this is not out of anger, this is not necessarily because there's a need to gain power over the child, although those aspects can feed into it, but where you'll have even, say, mother and father, in a very methodical way carrying out physical punishment, which sometimes can go on for hours and hours. I kind of add this special category of ritual abuse. There are various different examples that we can draw on, but the photo that you see here is a very common ritual that's done in Orthodox Jewish organizations, and certainly ultra-Orthodox Jewish organizations. It's called Mitzitza B'Peh, and what happens after a circumcision is a mohel will suck the wound. Well, about 85% of the population in the US has herpes 1, and when a rabbi passes on herpes 1 to an infant, it can be fatal. There have been babies that have died from this, suffered severe brain damage, and yet this practice is legal in every state. And I should add, too, that before Mitzitza B'Peh is done, they have obviously circumcised the baby. And I devote a whole chapter in my book to the genital cutting of children, both male and female, including cases that have happened in this country with females that were not justified with Jewish or Muslim doctrines, but actually Christian ones. You may be surprised to know that Blue Cross covered clitoridectomies in this country until the 1970s. Religious medical neglect is oftentimes, we don't hear about these cases until a child is dead. And this gravestone is that of a 15-year-old girl who was part of this group called the Followers of Christ in Idaho. More children die of religious medical neglect in Idaho than any other state, largely because of this particular church, although there are many churches out there that have committed these crimes. Idaho has a huge religious exemption that allows parents to do this without worrying about being prosecuted. In this case, Arian got food poisoning. And very often you will hear about these cases where the medical condition is perfectly treatable. with antibiotics, just being taken to a doctor, many other, diabetes, for example. But in this case, she got food poisoning. No one took her to a doctor as she was vomiting for days on end, and she got so dehydrated, and she was vomiting so much that she died of a ruptured esophagus. You would think that legislators in Idaho would be shocked and want to protect children like this, but instead they bring in their religious beliefs to the point where they feel completely justified. In fact, I have a quote here by a legislator who is basically saying that they're doing children a favor by not giving them medical treatment if it is religiously inspired. And this legislator said at a public hearing, those children, meaning the ones who have died, that have gone on, they're probably where we're all trying to get. They're there. They've got it made. If we can just live a righteous life, one day we'll be with them again. Religious emotional abuse is one that I think gets underplayed way too often, when I think it's actually the most common form of religious child maltreatment. And I'll just briefly say that in my book I talk about the 4 types in particular that I think you can see how they would manifest themselves in a religious setting. One is spurning, making a child feel like they are less than, maybe by telling them that God doesn't love them, or Jesus doesn't love them, or something like that. Terrorizing, telling a child, for example, they're going to go to hell or be left behind in the second coming. The 2 others are isolating and exploiting. And exploiting is sort of living your religion through a child. If you're in a position where you're talking to someone who is a religious person, and this takes a lot, especially for people in this room, because there are all kinds of triggery things that can happen if you're a survivor of religious child maltreatment, and then you're having discussion with someone who is of faith and they don't quite understand much about the issue. There are many different ways that religious folks will respond in a way that makes them feel like they're not part of the problem, or their religious organization, their church or synagogue or mosque is not part of the problem. They don't usually understand the systemic aspects of it. So I thought I'd just run through some of these. Myth 1 is everything about religion is for the good. Nothing as heinous as child abuse could ever be motivated by religion. Secondly, it's just the fault of a few bad apples. You'll hear this probably more commonly than any other justification, where people will say, you're always going to have perpetrators of child abuse anywhere you go, and nothing in my religion has to do with promoting that or failing to prevent that. We simply know that's not true. Myth 3 is, don't listen to the haters, the former members that are bitter, the apostates. They're just going to lie and they have it out for us. That's another one that I hear very commonly. In fact, I was talking to a relative of mine who is a very fervent Jehovah's Witness. Those were the first words out of her mouth. Well, a lot of those things are said by people who are no longer part of us, part of our group, and they can't be trusted. Myth 4, we're the victims. We're being persecuted. And anything bad that's said about us, they're in the wrong. I read one quote on some Facebook feed where the person said, my Jehovah's Witness grandmother was the nicest woman you could ever imagine. How could they say these terrible things about us? And finally, Myth 5, which is really a lot of what we're talking about today, is it only happens in cults. That's really easy for a lot of people in mainstream religions to want to think that it only happens in extreme groups. Those are the groups that, they're weird. They're the ones that worship flying saucers. They're the ones that follow, a guy with a long gray beard and a robe. That's not us, you know. And what we're going to talk about in a minute is just to really understand, well, what are the risk factors so that we can see when it's happening in any kind of religious setting, including those that are not totalitarian. So what I want to look at is just trying to determine which children are at risk for religious child maltreatment. And so in order to get at this, in evaluating criminal cases and studies and interviewing dozens of people who either were experts or survivors or even perpetrators, I found that as long as the culture that the child was being raised in, regardless of their religion, if the governance of that environment was done in an authoritarian way, whether it was in a single household or a larger community or an international religion that has millions of followers, if the parents, if the adults are being governed in an authoritarian way, then children are in trouble. And 3 ways that you can kind of determine whether a child is being raised in a religious authoritarian culture is, 1, there's a strict social hierarchy in the environment. 2, it's very fear-based. So there are punishments in store for people that don't abide by the rules, whether those punishments are in this life or in the next life. Thirdly, they are socially separatists. They don't have to be geographically isolated, although that definitely adds to problems, but they can also be in urban environments and being, for example, kids can be going to public school and be told, you know, you don't want to really trust those people that are not part of our religion. The way that these negative influences are harmful to kids is actually through the people who are the most most frequent adults to be perpetrating. If you look at most cases of abuse and neglect, just generally, you'll find that the most common perpetrators are parents or guardians. And so I looked at, well, how are parents affected by these religious authoritarian cultures? And when I read some information about what goes on in cults and got familiar with the term middle manager parents, I realized that was really the key. When you have what's considered to be a middle manager parent, it's someone who is really not using their own instincts to make decisions about child rearing. Instead of looking at a particular child's case as an individual and saying, well, you know, what do my instincts tell me as a parent to do in this situation? They kind of go more by a rule book, by a template. And so the children's individual's needs often are not met in a healthy way. And I always show this painting by Rembrandt of Abraham about to kill his child Isaac because he thinks that God told him to do that. To me, Abraham is like the poster middle manager parent. And this comes up in many other situations as well. And so I'm going to close my part here in introducing you to this Baptist minister, Sean Harris, who he gave this sermon that was audio recorded and then got him in a lot of trouble, although I think that what he's saying is not something all that unusual that goes on in some of these conservative churches, where he's talking to parents and he's telling them what they should do if their child doesn't act according to the rules, specifically acts as if they may be gay. And so I'm going to play some audio for you, and then I'm going to hand it off to my co-speaker, Dr. Romo.
Oh, your little son starts to act a little girlish when he's 4 years old, and instead of squashing that like a cockroach and saying, man up, son, get that dress off you and get outside and dig a ditch, because that's what boys do. you get out the camera and you start taking pictures of Johnny acting like a female, and then you upload it to YouTube, and everybody laughs about it, and next thing you know, this dude, this kid, is acting out childhood fantasies that should have been squashed. Can I make it any clearer? Dads, the second you see your son dropping the limp wrist, you walk over there and crack that wrist. Man up. Give him a good punch. Okay? You're not going to act like that. You were made by God to be a male, and you're going to be a male. And when your daughter starts acting too butch, you rein her in. And you say, oh no, sweetheart. You can play sports. Play them to the glory of God. But sometimes you're going to act like a girl and walk like a girl and talk like a girl and smell like a girl. And that means you're going to be beautiful, you're going to be attractive, you're going to dress yourself up. You say, can I take charge like that as a parent? Yeah, you can. You're authorized. I just gave you a special dispensation this morning to do that.
Hi. How are you doing after hearing that? And yeah. It was disturbing that the parents were kind of laughing and taking it in and being a part of that whole group of reinforcing. This is our tribe, or this is our group, right? Yeah. This is a dynamic, right? And to have the authority, this person gave them dispensations, right, to enact things. A God representative is a very powerful thing. And so when generally authoritarian people do hurtful things or impose their will on especially a vulnerable young person, that's damaging. But when has that layer of God, right, that's what leads to what some people experience as soul death. Right? That was certainly my experience. I'll say just briefly, I didn't grow up in what I considered an extreme community, a faith community. We were cradle Catholics. Mom was very, very involved in the parish. She translated the bulletins. She was a go-to person. I was identified as, I had a vocation early. Ended up going to a Catholic seminary. And so when I think of those ideas of separatism, we were kind of separate in that environment, but also we were kind of separate ideologically. I mean, I went to private schools. The threat was, if you're bad, you're going to go to a public school. And so we were separate. We were better, in a sense. When I was a professor, teacher education at the University of San Diego in 2002, I was at a conference for professors at Catholic institutions to discuss academic freedom. And we were on the East Coast, and at that point you've all seen Spotlight, yes? Very powerful story. So that was going on at that time. And those news reports weren't at all being discussed in this conference. And it was very disturbing for me on that level, because I wanted to talk about social justice issues and the impact of colonialism and how education can be a liberating kind of vehicle. But it started to trigger some of my own memories of being groomed and sexually abused by a pastor and another person in the diocese. And then that opened a floodgate of repressed memories. And so my experience growing up, though, was not in an extreme environment. Certainly we were vulnerable as growing up. We had in poverty and a lot of violence and alcoholism, and so we had terrible communication, and church was a safe place for us where we felt appreciated and safe and successful and so on. And so, and Janet described, so it was an honor to be adopted by a religious authority, and then to little by little have myself and the family and really the whole community be groomed. That series of sexual abuse experiences were buried for years. And so there are long-term impacts. And I say all that just to acknowledge that so many of the impacts of what Janet has been describing are very, very present in very mainstream environments. And I would say societally, we're in this place where bystanders are challenged to question our own experience. And I have a way of thinking about that we often, especially in faith settings, we see what we believe rather than we believe what we see. And so that was certainly my experience. There are plenty of things that were signs, that were red flags, that people couldn't see. Marianne Benkert and Tom Doyle have written about something they call religious duress. And so I didn't have anybody screaming in my experience growing up, but there was this authority whose, by being part of that community, we kind of gave over our critical thinking. We gave over our ability to question what was going on in our own experience, at the risk of being somehow out of that group. That was our whole community, our whole identity. So, all that's to say, that in many settings, we have dynamics of being identified with the group, and the group may not seem extreme. But here's a video of someone who's sharing his experience that maybe plenty of people can appreciate. And
Jerry Minor, who's one of our advisors, is a comedian, a comedic actor. He's been on HBO shows and SNL and things like that. And so we interviewed him over Skype, and so that's what this video is.
And then as it goes on, it seemed like everything from school, what I was studying in school, even to where we lived, seemed to be kind of predicated on this organization that we had gotten involved in. And then I've started to also be taught. So I'm going to 5 meetings a week. Also, I have my mother, she was encouraged to study the publications with me. So I'm also being indoctrinated, so to speak, during that time. So my mother at least would take at least an hour a week to sit me down and go through publication. A lot of these publications that they have are based, for young people. So she would get a book that was for a young person, and she would sit down and try to study that with me. And then, as time goes on, she even went to, my mother was a uber Jehovah's Witness, so she took it to the farthest extent. I mean, she was teaching me the deepest things about that organization and their philosophy and their theology at a really early age. I mean, I think I knew a lot of things at 10 or 11 years old, and a lot of that was really disconcerting. A lot of it I did not want, and vocally, like, say, I don't want to know this. Family. I still consider my mother abusive. I got beat a lot, and those were usually for behavioral things, for lying or not doing the chores or whatever. But I can say that it was better after she became a Jehovah's Witness. She seemed to have a little bit of better handle on her anger and outburst. But it definitely did not end it. It just made it a little bit different. Yes, they do encourage physical discipline, but they also encouraged more than that. And I will say this: there was an incident when I was growing up of a friend of mine who the Child Welfare Services got called on, and I saw my mother's behavior actually change after that. It wasn't like it was great. I mean, I still got beat, and I still think that the organization condoned that kind of thing. They definitely were. They definitely had the mantra spare the rod, spoil the child. I mean, that was, I remember as a child in this incident that I'm talking about, a friend of mine, when the state was called in, as far as to see if she was being abused, I remember feeling like, well, I don't know why they're doing that to the parent. She's totally justified in beating her child because the Bible says that we can do that. I remember feeling, as a child, feeling that way. I saw so many children that were, that got corporal punishment used against them, physical punishment used against them in the Kingdom Hall. And it's something that people don't talk about. And since there's just an overall okay with corporal punishment, I think that there was a real lack of really watching for children's well-being. At a certain time, I started to, around age 19, 18, I started to have, not necessarily doubts, but it became really depressed. Obviously, I didn't have a college education. I didn't have a lot of job prospects. And a lot of my friends were starting to have a lot. I had a friend that died after not receiving a blood transfusion. And I had a lot of other friends who were having just really a lot of emotional problems and were having a hard time in a lot of different ways. Were succumbing to a lot of different things, drugs and violence, a lot of different things that I didn't expect and was told that I would not see, within this organization, especially with the young people. And so I started to become disillusioned, and I found a girlfriend. But in all of that, I was still going to the elders in my congregation and saying, hey, I'm having a problem. I don't know what my problem is. And finally this was me approaching them and saying, hey, I've got a problem. I want help. Them saying, well, you need to be disfellowshipped for a while. And that was their formula for bringing me back into it somehow, getting me not disillusioned somehow. Child-friendly means, one of the main things is having a choice, giving a child a choice to what religion that they're going to become. I think that that's important. Every human being should have that. I think a lot of people would agree with that. It's something that wasn't given to me. I wasn't given the choice not to be a Jehovah's Witness. I think that might be disputed. They might say, no, you were given the choice, but I was given the choice along with losing my family, losing my support. So I don't really think that's a fair choice. And to keep in mind, the children don't necessarily and shouldn't be making the commitments that adults are making. The adults have experience and everything on their side, the legality of being able to make a choice for their future, and children shouldn't be held to that at that age. They should be able to get all the facts and do the same thing that adults have and make their decision on their own on what religion that they're going to be. Obviously, I know that, parents are going to have their children go to the services with them. They're going to have them with them. I understand that. But I think that there's also some consideration to letting the child make his own choice. And I think that's important. So if that's done, I think that can help a lot. But also keeping in mind, too, that we are advancing as mankind goes on, and then we've discovered certain things, and we've discovered things about rearing children and corporal punishment, and I think that should have just as much a part of the discussion as the moral part, or the whatever text your religion may be adhering to. I think we should also keep in mind what we know. What we know is that are the things that are beneficial for children. We should also keep that in mind along with whatever the Bible says.
I think you probably recognized various things that Jerry said relating to what I was talking about earlier. I just wanted to call out 3 quick ones. Initially, he was talking about religious indoctrination and going to church 5 times a week or something like that, that's a form of exploitation, religious exploitation, which is a form of emotional abuse. Secondly, he talked about a friend of his that died from not getting a blood transfusion. That relates to religious medical neglect, because Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe, most of them don't believe, that they should ever get a blood transfusion. And thirdly, he mentioned the term disfellowshipping. That is a way to excommunicate somebody. It goes along with those punishments that I told you about and that just about every relationship has. So excommunication in Jehovah's Witnesses is called disfellowshipping.
Failed to say earlier, thank you, Janet, for your brilliance and all the ways that you've made connections and brought some information together. He mentioned depression and some of the impacts of growing up in an abusive religious environment. Not everybody registers that. That certainly wasn't my experience. I mean, I was an overachiever. A lot of people self-destructed, but I went to Stanford. I got a master's. Got my doctorate. I mean, I was the first in my family to do that. I wanted out of the neighborhood, right? But none of it was resolved, right? So it did surface as it has to in order to be able to be useful and integrated. What can we do? I'm really, really happy that we are, I think, in a societal shift where we've gone from maybe the silence and secrecy of all kinds of child maltreatment, especially religious child maltreatment, to where people have spoken and broken their silence and maybe been disfellowed or felt ostracized or felt disconnected from that whole identity before, to actually then finding more ways to connect with others, new ways to be a spiritual person, to have meaning in life, not connected to this other one that they may have grown up with. And I think of the current, Me Too kind of movement and the expression in different ways of people acknowledging their experiences. And it seems to me like this is unstoppable. I mean, it's not just in churches. It could be the church of Hollywood. It could be the church of sports. It could be all kinds of ways that people have identified and become kind of bystanders to whatever was going on in those settings. So one thing we can definitely do is, and I think it's very helpful when Janet mentioned earlier, when people are defensive about hearing that there's something going on in an organization, that it's, oh no, this is a good one, or it's not possible, that we focus on what the reality of what's happening. How do we protect kids who are bringing their experience? That's our task. Right? And in fact, one of the Child Friendly Faith Project resources is to have kind of a process for congregations to start to reflect on, well, how do we protect kids in the context of our own tradition? And to begin that discussion, and then even later to delve more deeply, because that's a profound set of questions. When we start questioning, then everything unravels. At least I'm seeing it in my own experience and many others. And so we talk about, Janet mentioned, Idaho is one example of legislation, of a legislator who would protect organizations and who are not caring for kids in a way that leads to their death. And so religious exemptions is a real big deal. The statute of limitations, I know that that's a long, long battle that many groups have been raising for years. And I know in the group SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, that's been a huge focus. And that group has found that one of the major resistors to that has been the Catholic Church. Right? And so, and as you saw in that movie, Spotlight, there's a whole culture of community of attorneys and others, and that's not isolated to there, or to that particular faith tradition. And so how can we actually go upstream, right? Not just in the legislation, but in education? And so how do we support those middle manager parents? How do we acknowledge the value that they put in their own upbringing or their own beliefs, and hold to what we see, not just what we believe. And so some of that, I think, is so possible from people who come from those traditions and those experiences. And I know for me, when I, years ago, started getting very involved with SNAP, and I'm not very involved now at all, I'm a minister for healing and healthy environments, right, in the United Church of Christ. And my approach now is much more dealing directly and educationally and other ways with the trauma, individual and collectively. But in those early press meetings and protests and all that stuff, when I would see myself in the news next to someone else who had a few more years of experience, I remember thinking, wow, I look so angry, you know? And I couldn't help it. I mean, that was this part of me that just was flooding. Right? And over time, and I'm looking forward to presentations that relate to spirituality, how do we integrate that so that it becomes useful? Right? And there's an expression, and it's somewhat parochial to kind of a Christian image, but the idea of healing, some people would call it forgiveness, is getting off the cross because we need the wood. Right? So not just owning and identifying with the suffering and the victimization, I know that. I used to do the Pain Olympics. But being able to then integrate that and be in a place where we can be a step ahead and acknowledge the tension, the contradiction of, you know, a religious setting, a faith setting, a mainstream setting, and the harm that happens.
In terms of trying to reach parents and families that may be in a harmful religious setting, and try to help them determine whether or not they're in a religious authoritarian culture, and they should maybe move to one that's more healthy. I put together this list of questions that parents can ask themselves, although I was told by a CPS worker that he felt that this should also be something CPS and other people in child protection should also get a hold of. These are just questions that they can ask themselves to help them determine whether or not they should stay or go. So I'll just read a few of them. It actually goes on for 2 or 3 pages. Is my faith community theologically exclusive? That is, do religious leaders and other worshipers claim to be the only people who know religious truth? Does my community fear or hold in contempt those who are not part of our faith? Do I feel at ease asking questions, voicing complaints, or expressing feelings of religious doubt to those in authority or others? Do I raise my child according to strict guidelines or beliefs held by my faith community? Would I be rebuked or treated coldly if I did not follow those norms, including enforcing strict discipline in the home and using physical punishment in ways that make me feel uneasy? Do my faith leaders tell us God wants us to spank our kids? Are children in my place of worship treated respectfully, even when they misbehave, or are they made to feel shameful? If parents or children need help managing their lives, does my place of worship offer suggestions for mental health services, or simply tell them to talk to a member of the clergy, pray harder, or undergo an exorcism?
So much to talk about. Education is a big deal. Jerry in that video mentioned, you know, we need to take in new information. We know more about child development. We know more about the adverse childhood experiences that people grow up with. How many are familiar with that study? I would encourage you to learn more. Not just those 10 items that were identified, but certainly religious experiences can be very traumatic and very harmful. All kinds of things can be. We know more about the brain and how we learn. And so Jan mentions, you know, churches, environments that are kind of fear-based. Well, we know that impacts the brain in a certain way, right? We then are acting more out of the lizard brain rather than the connection of the neocortex. So we know science. We know all these things. And unfortunately, I mean, there's a writer, Ken Wilber, The Theory of Everything, talks about the kind of the evolution of the ways of thinking and ways of working together. And that, unfortunately, those who are really attached to particular religious traditions are often the last to evolve in the face of facts or new information or things that are, you know, experience. So we need to learn more about child development, and that is new, I think, in a lot of areas, and the ways that these different traumatic experiences impact people, and understand that it's not just in certain ways like, cutting or, physical manifestations or what we see as depression, but it can be also in other ways. As many people that work real hard to cover their experiences, to fit in and to achieve and to find some sense of self-worth. Reporting is a huge step to help people move from bystander to be an ally. And I think that's happening more and more as we begin to speak out. There are, I see, policy changes that are far ahead of the practice, far ahead of the cultural change. The Child Friendly Faith Project is all about education of leaders and congregants. To not critique, to not judge, but I mean, my role as a teacher isn't so much like sharing what I know, but helping people to understand what they know and to integrate that, take new information and make it their own so that they can become masters of their own experience and their own information, create their own understanding theory. And that basic acceptance, going from denial to recognition to reconciling, that we can have in one person or in one organization both that which does harm as well as that which has been life-giving and really helpful. And that's a difficult thing for many people to hold on to. And so I'll stop there. So related to that, we need to give up the idea that religion is perfect, that the church of which we are a part is infallible. And religion, like our parents, has the capacity to bless us and to wound us. And it inevitably does both at different times. Only when we are aware of the capacity of religion to abuse can we guard against that abuse and take steps to curb it where it exists.
That was a quote by an advisor to the Child Friendly Faith Project who passed away last year. And he wrote an amazing book called Religious Abuse. And it covers many different aspects of it, including relating it to children. Finally, this is our contact information. We'll open it up to questions, but just wanted to make sure you knew you can get in touch with us if you have any further questions or want to get a PDF of the slideshow or talk about any of these things. And we're also always open to having people join us. I think people, especially in this conference, have so many fields of expertise that could be so helpful. So if you want to work with us in any way, please get in touch.
And one more kind of plug thing is, Michael hopefully will send out a SurveyMonkey link for everyone in the conference to respond to, and it'll be very helpful, especially in this group, to get a sense of background and how that relates to your understanding, your perception of this topic. While there's no legal duty in a confessional because it's protected, there's no obligation for forgiveness in the confessional. There's no reason, and Richard Sipe and many others who have looked at the Catholic experience in particular are real clear about there's no canon law that says that when someone confesses any kind of maltreatment, any kind of sexual abuse in particular, that confessor must say you're forgiven. The confessor is fully authorized to say you must report yourself, because I'm not offering that forgiveness until you do so.
And also, different states have different laws about whether clergy are mandated to report or not. And so, there are states where a clergy are just as required legally to report as they would be if they were teachers or doctors or lawyers. And then there are some states that exempt clergy, and then there are some that specifically exempt clergy in confession.
So the question is, are there major conferences that people can go to, particularly with religious groups, that would deal with this? I would say it's a topic that is probably more welcome in conferences like the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma that's held in San Diego annually in the fall, and then in Hawaii, I think, in the spring, more likely there. And that topic has been brought several times compared to in a traditional kind of religious setting.
And this is a sore point for me because I've found it a little difficult to break into religious conferences to talk about issues that are negative. I did speak at one that was what was put on by a spiritual organization called the Mika Project in Minnesota, and they wanted the whole conference to be basically on spiritual abuse and religious child maltreatment. But most of the time, conferences, and even ones that are geared towards child abuse, will not want to give a whole lot of time to this particular topic. So it is a goal of ours to open that up a little bit more and try to give a similar talk as this at religious conferences. Do you want to repeat that?
Just even in a secular context, it's difficult to actually sustain attention and support to make changes. And I'm mindful of our time. Yes, this is a huge issue because we're so crisis-driven, we're so reaction-driven, and so that impacts all kinds of issues, not just religious ones. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Are we out of time? Okay. Thank you very much.